people are always asking you for the best arguments against God. So I'd love to flip that a little bit and ask you, and through all the debates you've done, all the conversations and work you've done, what's the best argument you've heard for God?
That's a good question. I think the most intriguing argument is probably the sort of fine-tuning type argument, the one that says that the conditions that the universe needs to exhibit in order for us to appear and reflect on its existence are so unlikely, so improbable that there must be some kind of intelligence behind the scenes that set things up that way. That's certainly a very intriguing argument. I mean, the problem with it is it's not really an argument for God at all. It's merely an argument for some sort of background intelligence. It doesn't have to be a God, as Paul Davies, the physicist, points out. He wrote a book called the Goldilocks Enigma, I think it was called. Why does the universe have the Goldilocks property of being just right, for life and consciousness and so on? And it is a very interesting question. But he thought it unlikely that, the Judeo-Christian God is the right explanation, because it's a huge leap from there's some intelligence behind the universe to the conclusion that it's that particular supremely powerful and benevolent being. In fact, that's particularly difficult to maintain that once you start looking at the contents of the universe and just how much pain and suffering it contains. So that's an that would be the one I would go with if I was kind of trying to make a case for God, despite its obvious shortcomings. Yeah.
Is the whole something from nothing argument a case of asking the wrong question? There's that example of just asking what's north until you get to the North Pole, right? And what's north of the North Pole?
Yeah.
That's the wrong question to be asking.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, so in philosophy, if you're faced with a puzzle, you can try and come up with a solution. It's a sort of straightforward way of approaching the puzzle, but a slightly more radical and interesting, sometimes more interesting way of approaching the puzzle is to suggest that there was something wrong with the question that was being asked in the first place. And it may be, and my suspicion is that there really is something wrong with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? Kant thought that there was something wrong with the question, what caused the universe to exist? It involves a kind of confusion or muddle. And maybe he's right. Maybe there is something wrong with that. I'm quite sympathetic to that view. As you say, you can keep pressing the question, what's north of this and what's north of that? And eventually you hit the North Pole. And if somebody asks what's north of the North Pole, they've kind of misunderstood how the word north is used. Similarly, you can ask, well, what caused, the planet to exist? What caused the solar system to exist? And eventually you come up with, and what caused the universe to exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And at that point, it may be that you're pressing a question that, again, doesn't really deserve an answer. Rather, you've got yourself in a bit of a muddle. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And for our, everyone listening today, we have some, there's so much I want to discuss with you about, some of the biggest questions that pop up around these debates and discussions, which is why I've really been looking forward to having you on. And so last night, I was flicking through some of your debates on YouTube. You've had a lot of interesting debates with a lot of religious thinkers. You touched on one argument there, but I wonder, have there been any arguments presented to you that have really surprised you the most, either by how persuasive they were or how slippery they were to get around? Are there any arguments that really it took you back a little bit?
Not particularly, because, I'm a philosopher and I spend a bit of time sort of researching the area before I get into debates. So it's unusual that somebody comes up with an argument that, I've not come across ever before, that I think, oh, this is actually really quite an interesting, powerful argument. William Lane Craig, actually, in our debate, came up with the response to the problem of evil, and in particular the problem of animal suffering, by suggesting that animals don't really suffer. and then suggesting that this was supported by the science somehow. Don't suffer significantly. And so that was a bit of a surprise, bit of a turn up. To be honest, I didn't really respond very much to that because I just thought it was really ludicrous. So that was kind of a surprise. Recently, I've come up against someone who suggests that we can deal with the problem of animal suffering and hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before we even show up by they had a conversation with somebody who thinks that you can deal with the problem of animal suffering by suggesting that it's actually their characters are somehow being built. There's this sort of character building theodicy, which has maybe some plausibility when it comes to human beings, but this is then sort of extended backwards for hundreds of millions of years. All of these creatures are having the opportunity to sort of grow and develop as a result of being burnt to death in forest fires or whatever it might happen to be. That was a bit, again, that was, that was quite surprising, but the guy had added all sorts of, epicycles to this in order to try and make it work. But, I hadn't, until I'd come across this guy, I hadn't really come across that particular suggestion.
I've heard this one being touted, this idea of character building in animals. And the thing I've always struggled with there is when it comes to, if there's, say, some sort of suffering or discomfort you could maybe learn from, I can understand. But when it comes to suffering for suffering's sake, so say an animal that's been caught in a trap and has been, there for days just suffering. I've never been entirely convinced on the character building that can come from that. But I've seen people suggest that it's character building for a life beyond Earth.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, usually if something, I mean, that's over several days, so possibly there's some opportunity to kind of stop and think about life, the universe and everything. But if you're just trapped in a forest fire and dead within 30 seconds, whether you're a child or a mammal, some other species, there's no opportunity to reflect. There's no opportunity to learn some deep moral lesson. You're just going to die in agony, screaming, panicking, completely out of control. It's ludicrous to suggest that this gives the either the human or the animal any some sort of character building opportunity. And in fact, in response to that, the chap with whom I was having this conversation then suggested that God somehow learns from the experience. Yeah, I couldn't really make God, can God suffer? Well, not, on the face of it, it's difficult to see how he could, being the kind of being that he is. But if he kind of sort of gets in alongside us with our suffering, then he can experience pain and suffering, and that allows him to develop perhaps in various ways. So that sort of suggestion might be made. That seems pretty implausible to me. I can't really make much sense of how that's going to work. Pains are essentially private. One mind can't access the pain of another individual. It's impossible. That would apply even to God. But even if it did apply, why would you need hundreds of millions of years of this? Why not just one animal suffering? That would do it. Then God would know. Why does he keep doing it over and over again on an industrial scale over millions of years? Again, there's no real explanation for that. So these are, ingenious, convoluted ways of trying to deal with what is pretty obviously, I think, an insurmountable problem. I mean, you just can't square a supremely powerful and benevolent creator with what we observe.
No, and this is something that I think our audience have long agreed with is obviously the one problem that many people can't get past. It probably is the reason that most people who don't believe in a God don't believe in that God. I've sort of gone out of my way on this show to speak with apologists and experts in that field, and I've asked the question many times. Personally, I've never found a somewhat satisfying answer. They all seem to get lost on me a little bit. But have you ever heard any somewhat of a satisfying answer over the problem of suffering, or is it just one of those questions to you that as you mentioned there, you just can't square it no matter what way you look at it.
I can't square it, no. But perhaps the most interesting response is not to provide a theodicy or explanation necessarily, but to suggest that you don't need to do that, because all you really need to do is to acknowledge that we are limited human beings and that there could easily be reasons that are beyond our ken, that are nevertheless known to God. So, maybe there's a reason back there that explains why all of this suffering is actually on balance for the best. It's just that we're not in a position to know what that reason is, whereas obviously God is. So given that we can't be confident that there isn't such a reason back there somewhere beyond our ability to discern it, so we can't know that any of the evils that we see, any of the pain and suffering is ultimately, gratuitous, in the sense that there's no adequate God justifying reason for it. So that's the position of what's known as skeptical theism. So it's theism plus, we're being skeptical about our ability to know the reasons God might have for allowing the pain and the suffering. I think that's probably the most promising response to the problem of evil. Rather than cook up the explanations, just insist that, well, even if we can't think of an explanation, there could easily be one back there somewhere that we haven't thought of. I've published a few papers on that. I think that ultimately that doesn't really work either. But I've expended more energy on that because it looks at least slightly more promising. Yeah.
One of the other big questions, and I know you would have thought about this, and I know you've spoken about this a couple of times, but what about the suggestion then that we need religion for a sense of real morality to exist?
Yeah. The kind of moral argument for God is one of the most popular with sort of evangelicals, despite the fact that it's one of the least popular when it comes to sort of professional philosophers. They tend to rank it quite low. Not a particularly good argument, but I think it's psychologically effective, and I think evangelicals recognize its psychological effectiveness because it's very good at inducing a sense of moral panic. If you can get people to start thinking, oh my God, if there's no God, then there's no right and wrong. If there's no right and wrong, then anyone can do anything and anything goes. And I can't really tell people that they can't do that anymore. And oh my God, it panic stations, right? So that's what they do. Because it's psychologically, if you can induce that kind of panic, moral panic, you can get people to shift in ways that otherwise they might not have. Having said that, I mean, you could argue that no, there is a good argument in there. Actually, you can construct a good argument from the existence of objective moral facts to God. They never really tell you, or rarely do they tell you what the argument actually is. They just sort of intimate that it's there. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values. Premise 1, there are objective moral values. Premise 2, therefore there is a God. First premise. So what's the argument for that then? Rarely do they provide it. Usually they try and get you to explain why it isn't true, rather than actually give you a good argument for why it is true. It's an interesting line of attack. I think that the case against God is so overwhelming that even if you could show that the first premise is true, that if there is no God, there are no objective moral values, then while it seems that there are objective moral values, I would be much more inclined to give that up rather than embrace God, because the evidence against God is so overwhelming. Whereas, we're putting that up against, well, it seems to us as if there are objective moral values, but, appearances can be deceptive, and, it doesn't seem like the earth moves, but it does. It turns out on reflection that appearances are not that reliable. And so although we have evolved to think of ourselves as being answerable to sort of these objective moral facts, it may be that they don't exist. And I'm not entirely sure that they do anyway. I mean, setting aside matters, theism, there are reasons to be somewhat suspicious about these supposed facts, and philosophers have been pointing this out for a very long time. So, do they exist or not? I don't really have a view on that. I'm not a worked out view. I'm not a moral philosopher. But moral philosophers, for the most part, don't think the answer is to embrace God. The reason that God and objective morality are linked is usually as a sort of rhetorical device to try and induce a kind of moral panic in the audience.
So, you mentioned there about the evidence being overwhelming, this being pretty obvious to you. I wonder what evidence would it take for you to sort of consider the other side? So a lot of people tend to cite, and when I've spoken to people who are really passionate on the other side of the fence, they say that they all had experiences that can't be explained with words. They can't communicate that experience to you unless you experience it yourself. I wonder what your take on that is, and whether that's something you say, hey, well, I haven't experienced it. Maybe if I did experience that, it would be different. Or do you look at things like that and think the experience of a visit from God or Jesus is kind of a different variety of someone saying they were visited by a demon or a ghost, so to speak?
Yeah. So, if you run out of steam with the arguments and the evidence, a fallback position is to say, well, I just know through some kind of personal experience, and I just know directly. I don't need to infer that God exists. God has just directly revealed his existence to me in some kind of immediate way, so I can be absolutely sure that God exists. That's it's tempting. It's certainly true that it can be reasonable to believe something just because it strikes you very strongly as being that way. There's a principle in philosophy called the principle of phenomenal conservatism, associated with a philosopher called Michael Huemer. And it's a pretty plausible principle that, if it's really strongly seems to you a particular way, and you've no reason to think there's anything funny going on, that you're being deceived or manipulated, or that there's very strong evidence against this belief, then it can be reasonable to believe it. So, if it seems to me like there's a cup of coffee on the table in front of me, then it's reasonable for me to believe that, other things being equal. So given this principle, then you can apply it to God and say, well, as long as it seems to people that there is a God and they've no reason to think there's anything funny going on, then it's perfectly reasonable for them to believe in God. They don't need evidence and they don't need arguments, and so on. So I've got some sympathy with that general position. And I think that if it seemed to some person, I don't know, some remote rainforest dweller hundreds of years ago, perhaps, that there is a God, then it might be reasonable for them to believe that. I don't think it's reasonable for most of us to believe it, however, because, as I say, the principle says it's reasonable to believe the appearance, other things being equal, but other things ain't equal. We have loads of evidence that we human beings are horribly prone to error when it comes to believing in invisible supernatural beings of an extraordinary variety, of which God is just merely one. There is no culture on the face of the earth ever where you don't find many people, believing in tree spirits, dead ancestors, water sprites, gods in the sky, whatever it might happen to be. There's just, elves and gnomes and fairies, and it just goes on and on and on and on. We human beings are highly prone to false positive beliefs in beings like that. And once you know that, then you ought to be distrustful of any experience that you have along those lines. You know, if it seems to me that there's a snake on the grass in front of me, well, then other things being equal, it's reasonable for me to believe that. But if I learn that I've been given a drug that causes very powerful and convincing snake hallucinations, or if I've been told that some joker's been tossing rubber snakes around and they look really, really convincing, well, then it's no longer reasonable for me to trust my experience, to take appearance at face value. The principle of phenomenal conservatism doesn't say it's reasonable to believe under those circumstances. And those are the circumstances, as far as most of us nowadays are concerned. We know all of this stuff. We ought to know by now that we humans are horribly prone to getting it wrong when it comes to these kind of experiences. And so you should be pretty distrustful. If you happen to have one, it seems to me. So that's how I would kind of respond to that suggestion. But you're also right, of course, that, you know, given that I don't have one of these experiences, doesn't give me the slightest reason to believe in God anyway. Yeah.
One of my longtime friends is deeply religious, and he often says that, or explains to me about the meaning he gets from it, and he talks about this, a world without God, almost losing its meaning. And I wonder, from your perspective, do you think secular philosophy can provide that meaning in the absence of religion?
Yeah, well, it depends what you. It's one of those classic philosophers' answer. It depends what you mean by meaning, really. What kind of meaning are we after? Some kind of cosmic meaning with a capital C and a capital M. I'm not entirely sure what that even is. You know, I don't know how to get my head around that. Let alone know how to supply it. It's true that people do get a sense of meaning and purpose from religion, and in the absence of religion, maybe that can't really be replaced, in the same way that, you know, if you really believe in Santa and the North Pole and the presents and so on, you know, Christmas has a kind of weird rosy glow that once the bubble has popped, you can never get it back. We can't, perhaps vicariously through our children, we can kind of enjoy it again a little bit, but you can never really get it back. That kind of significance and meaning is lost, and you can't really replace it, no matter how many mince pies you eat. Similarly, then, it may be that, you know, with religion, once the bubble's popped, you're going to lose stuff, and you're never really going to be able to get it back. You know, and my response to that is, well, tough. You know, you're just gonna have to deal with that. I'd rather believe what's true than I would believe what, you know, makes me feel good. So yeah. Having said that, I'm not really answering your question in terms of coming up with ways in which life might be meaningful. I mean, many people would argue that actually religion strips meaning from life, because when you look at the religious answers as to what makes life meaningful, they're really not very convincing. The idea that, you know, there's a God that made me to worship him, why does that make my life meaningful? I don't know. I have no idea. The idea that I get to live forever makes my life meaningful. Why? I don't know what the answer to that question. I don't know why that would be. Why is a longer life more meaningful than a shorter life? Very often, shorter lives seem more meaningful than longer ones. I don't get it. So there are these. So they suggest that God and religion provide these kind of meanings, but when you kind of read the small print, it's not so clear that they really are providing you with some kind of cosmic meaning to your life. Just a sort of promissory note that, you know, in some mysterious way, your life will be meaningful, or more meaningful than it was before. When we usually make judgments about meaningful lives, you know, we'll point to people whose lives are meaningful, you know, Scott of the Antarctic or Marie Curie or whoever, will say, wow, these were meaningful lives. And then we'll point to some other people and say, well, these lives weren't terribly meaningful. The person that sat on the sofa and watched TV for their entire life, not a terrifically meaningful. We recognize what's a meaningful life and what isn't, whether we're religious or not. So the criteria that we're applying, for the most part, have got nothing to do with religion. We can tell which lives are meaningful and which are not independently. And we recognize that many non-religious people have meaningful lives. in the absence of belief in God, you can have a meaningful life, a meaningful existence. So, yeah, I think we're possibly being scammed a little bit when it comes to the suggestion that you can only have a meaningful life if you sign up to religion.
Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work directly, but there are a lot of other people that do the same. I wonder what your thoughts are on someone like the way Jordan Peterson would sort of blend Jungian archetypes, religious philosophy, Christianity, and moral responsibility. Do you see that as helpful or harmful to the public understanding of philosophy and religion?
Well, I used to feel that I had some understanding of what Jordan Peterson was on about. And in fact, I kind of admired his response to the journalist Kathy Newman on Channel 4 when he really gave her a hard time because she hadn't done her homework and he made her look foolish, as he should have done, actually. So that was impressive. But since then, he seems to have gone down some bizarre rabbit hole of obscurity. And I can barely understand what he's on about, if at all, nowadays. And I had dinner, funnily enough. I sat around the table having dinner with Jordan Peterson and some other people a couple of years ago. And he only ate steak. It's true. This really did only eat steak. His wife is Catholic. He brought some guests, all of whom were really conservative, right-wing Catholics with views about the role of women, for example. I think he's entered a kind of social circle in which it would be very difficult for him to just straightforwardly reject religious belief. On the other hand, he never quite seems to commit to it. And so there's this sort of fudge going on. And so I've kind of lost interest now. I can't really be bothered to drill down into what it is that he does think. It's just too hard to pin down. I'm sure he's got some valuable insights, actually, because he's an intelligent man. And some of his advice seems to be pretty sensible. And I'd want to endorse that. But as to his views on religion, I can't make much sense of them anymore. It seems to be drifting into pseudo-profundity, which I wrote a chapter on in my book, Believing Bullshit, the recipes for pseudo-profundity and how you can appear to be deep and have real insight into the human condition while actually saying very little, or committing yourself to very little. And I suspect, possibly I'm being unfair, but I suspect that Jordan Peterson might be a bit guilty of that. Nowadays.
On that then, the pseudo profundity. So we have so many, there's so many influences, so many people in this space now. We see these videos from who are trying to or appear really insightful, or all the podcasts that are out in the world these days. So what advice would you give to someone then on spotting that pseudo profundity and separating that from the sort of genuine person?
Yeah, well, it is. There are various recipes. So I'll give you a few recipes. So the first one is to state the obvious. But say it very slowly and with gravitas. If you say things about the big themes: life, sex, money, death. Death is the end. If you start talking like that, people are going to, yes, it really, and then the next thing you can do is start contradicting yourself. So famously, George Orwell's 1984, the slogans of the party are something like "War is peace, freedom is slavery," and I've forgotten the third one. And if you contradict yourself, again, you can appear to be saying something deep because people go, oh, maybe there is some truth in that. Maybe if we understand that correct, war is peace, freedom is slavery. Well, in a way, I can kind of, you can start to cook up. Yeah. So you just contradict yourself and you let your audience do all the work for you. Again, if you do it on the big themes, life, sex, money, death, you can create the illusion that you have some deep insight. And in fact, religions often involve contradictions. usually an atheist on the outside will say, well, they're contradicting themselves, so that can't be true. God is, and yet he's not. One and yet he's many. Whereas for the people in the cult, this is an indication that now we're really getting somewhere because we're contradicting ourselves. Now we're really getting some insight into the fundamental nature of reality. So state the obvious, contradict yourself. You can use deepities. Daniel Dennett famously came up with one recipe for pseudo-profundity. His example is love is just a word, which is ambiguous, because if you put love in quotation marks, it's true. Love, the word, is the word. Whereas if you take the quotation marks away, love is just a word. Well, that's clearly not true, because love might be many things, an illusion, an emotion, but it ain't a word. But by obscuring which of these two things you're saying, the interesting but false claim or the banal but true claim, you can create the illusion that you're saying something really quite profound. Love is just a word. And people go, how true that is. So that's another recipe you can use. There are ways of using analogies that are very good at creating the illusion of profundity. Jargon is extremely helpful. Reference quantum mechanics. You can't go wrong, really. Like Deepak Chopra. So there are various recipes you can use. The key thing to do, really, I think, is to just ask people or ask yourself, what exactly are you saying? If you could write that down on the back of an envelope, what exactly is it that you're telling me? And if they can't do that, or if it's unclear, that's at least a warning sign. I mean, it might be because it's so very, very deep and complicated that, they can't do it. Or it might be because there really isn't anything very substantial there at all, and it's all just smoke and mirrors. So first step really should be to try and try and get them to make it as clear as they possibly can. And if they are resistant to that, that's definitely an indication, I'm not going to put it clearly because, that would be somehow betraying the subtlety of my thought. So I'm not even going to start. That's an indication that they're bullshitting you.
Yes. And anytime I hear someone trying to be deeply insightful and they reference quantum mechanics or the double slit experiment and how that may explain, that's where I step back. Yes, I love that. One person who a massive voice in this space who's been divisive is Richard Dawkins, someone I know you've shared the stage with at times as well. Now, what area, where do you think, when the way he approaches these conversations, do you see them as effective or sometimes counterproductive to public discourse? Is a man who is very divisive, very polarizing. Do you see him to be an effective voice or counterproductive at times?
I think he has been very effective, and I like his approach. He's simple, clear, direct, and won't tolerate people bullshitting him. Let's do that. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Religious people are often used to others treating their views with a degree of respect and reverence that really they don't merit. I mean, these are just beliefs like any other, like political beliefs and so, we shouldn't have to handle them with kid gloves. We shouldn't give them a degree of respect that they don't merit. So, often it comes as a shock to a religious person to come up against someone like Dawkins who just, says it like, I don't believe that. Why should I think that's true? What's the evidence for that? These are questions, straightforward, direct questions that they often just don't get. And when they do get, they're inclined to say, well, no, you're not being very respectful of my beliefs. And, you need to show a little bit more respect. And, I don't think these beliefs are any more or less deserving of respect than any others. So there's that. I think he's good at that. I fully respect him for the no-nonsense approach he takes. I also like the fact that he will sometimes take the piss a little bit, as we say in the UK. He's not, he'll use humour. Again, people who are bullshitting hate that because it's a spell breaker. It's a bit like in The Emperor's New Clothes, when the Emperor's parading around naked, but he's persuaded himself and those around him that he's dressed in finery that can only be seen by the most subtle and sophisticated of audiences. And then some small child points and laughs, and suddenly the spell is broken and everyone suddenly realizes that they've been conned. So humor is a very useful tool, actually, in breaking the spell. I don't think you should only use humor. You should have good arguments and evidence and so on. But humor should be part of the recipe. And of course, those who are pompous bullshitters hate it because of its ability to break the spell. So I admire Dawkins' use of a bit of humor. I think that's good. But I disagree with him about some things too. I think his views on Islam recently, I've not been a fan of those. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the respect that is expected when it comes to religion. And I often think about this because I think if I was to say, walk into the office tomorrow and I said to everyone, hey, listen, I was listening to this ex-military commander last night, and he's talking about all this evidence he's got to suggest the existence of UFOs. It showed up on his radar. He saw something move at X speed. People in the office would be looking at me thinking, what's he taking this morning? What is this guy on about? Okay. But if I walked into the office and said, guys, listen, there's this God that we can't see, we've got no evidence for, but he created the world in 7 days. Everyone would be going, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that could make sense. This seems, there's a different sort of approach when it comes to religion, that people are there's a fear in questioning it.
Yeah, there's a kind of respect. I'm sure you're right. It becomes particularly clear, I think, when it comes to things like exemptions to the law on equal equality and equal opportunity legislation. So if I am a awful racist and I own a hotel, and a bit of a bigot, and I put up a sign that says no gays, no blacks, I'm going to be prosecuted, and quite right too.
Yeah.
However, if I'm a religious person and I say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't allow gay couples to stay in my hotel because of my religious convictions, people are going to go, oh, yeah, I'm going to take that seriously because it's religion. He's got religious reasons for not wanting to allow these people to stay in his hotel. Or, he's a baker. I don't want to bake a cake for a gay couple. I'm refusing to do that. I'm not doing gay weddings. Sorry. Oh, no, that's okay because, he's got religious reasons. We need to respect those. I don't think religion adds any weight whatsoever to these claims. I think it's irrelevant. I mean, in the same way that, if somebody, sometimes we should exempt people the law, or the rules. So, for example, if a doctor has a powerful moral objection to performing abortions, they think it's wrong, then I don't think the hospital should, under most circumstances, force them to perform abortions. But it's not because they're religious, it's because they've got a powerful moral objection. If their objection happens to be rooted in religion, that adds nothing relevant. I don't care. As sprinkling religion on someone's moral convictions adds no weight to them whatsoever, or at least it shouldn't, so far as the law is concerned. So similarly then, if somebody's a bigot and they turn away gay people from their hotel, they should be prosecuted. If they're a religious bigot and they happen to turn gay people away from their hotel, they should be prosecuted. The fact that they're religious bigots is irrelevant. It doesn't add any further weight to their moral objections whatsoever. the idea that, somehow religion deserves special respect and special privileges and special protections, they're just more beliefs. Very often they're political beliefs. And I don't think that they, as a category, should have any particular, status, special status. Yeah.
So the last topic I really want to discuss with you, and for our audience who may be joining us today that aren't familiar with your work. Now, you asked one of the most famous questions in this debate, and if it's reasonable to believe in an all good God, why isn't it just as reasonable to believe in an all evil God? Now, some of the pushback on this is that a good God and a perfectly good God and a perfectly evil God aren't really equal opposites. So I wonder what you make of that pushback. Do you think the two sides are genuinely symmetrical, or is one more believable than the other?
They may be. It may be that there are some differences that are important, and it could be interesting to explore those. But really, what I'm doing with this Evil God challenge, I think, primarily is, again, I'm using it as a kind of a spell breaker. So people will say they believe in God, and then they're presented with objections, evil, and they will cook up answers to that. Thousands of years of practice of doing that. They'll deploy skeptical theism, and they'll convince themselves that really they've brought the problem down to size now. It's manageable. It's not fatal to their Christian or Muslim or whatever belief. And I think that if you come at people head on with this kind of evidence, they're ready for you, whereas a good strategy is to not come at them head on, but point to some other belief instead that we both agree. Well, those people over there are kind of crazy. That's an absurd belief. Why would anyone believe that? And you get them to agree about that, and then we kind of unpack what it is that these people over there are doing and thinking, and only then do you then say, but how does what you're doing differ from what they're doing? So you've kind of crept around the back of their usual defenses. Rather than coming at them sort of straight ahead, you're kind of creeping around the back and using an analogy to get them to reflect on what they're doing and how they're thinking. And that, I think, is often more effective. If you want to kind of deprogram people. So that's what the Evil God Challenge does. The idea is that, people go, Evil God? Absurd. Why is it absurd? Well, look around you. Too much ice cream and laughter and rainbows and puppies. And, this is clearly not the kind of world an evil God would create. But then we come up with some, reverse theodicies. We say, oh, no, but evil God actually would... he's going to give you free will because he wants you to do evil of your own volition, because otherwise there's no moral evil in the universe. So he gives you free will, and then you choose to do good. He hates it, but it's the price he has to pay for moral evil existing. So we've used the theodicy, then we've flipped it, and then you can do that with many of the other theodicies and so on. You can deploy skeptical theism. Maybe there is a reason for the goods. An evil God will allow these goods. It's just we can't think of what that reason is. It's beyond our ability to figure it out. Show a little humility. There could easily be good reasons for the goods that we see that can be squared with the existence of an evil. These are just the same explanations that Christians give typically when they're presented with the problem of evil. But now it's clear that it's ludicrous. It is ridiculous to believe in an evil God. And these moves are clearly it's just evasive nonsense. So now the challenge then is, why is what you're doing not evasive nonsense too? Isn't it just perfectly obvious that there is no good God, and you're just kind of endlessly cooking up and gerrymandering these ludicrous explanations in order to try and square what you believe with what's right in front of your face, basically? That's kind of what's the aim. Now, you could then respond to that by saying, but, Stephen, haven't you realized that, actually the very concept of an evil God doesn't make sense, whereas the concept of a good God does? There's some problem with the idea of an evil God. That's very contentious. Maybe there is. Say, for example, a similar a move you could make is to say, well, evil is just an absence or privation, Catholic view. So the idea of an evil God is all privation and nothing else. It's all whole and no cheese in a Swiss cheese, which is basically, it doesn't make any sense, right? Whereas, so there can't possibly be an evil God. That response is basically irrelevant to the challenge, because what I'm pointing out is that whether or not the idea of an evil God makes sense, maybe it doesn't, who cares? We can still rule it out on the basis of observation. There's just too much good for this to be the creation of a supremely powerful and malevolent deity. I'm pointing out that there's this extra problem with an evil God is simply beside the point. My point is this: why is, if the problem of good is fatal to belief in an evil God, why isn't the problem of of evil fatal to belief in a good God? You know, there's a symmetry there that I can't see how to break. And you just change the subject, basically. So yeah, that's how I would typically respond, depending on exactly what they're saying. That's how I would respond. Yeah.
Yeah, because I came across this. This tends to be the main pushback. Is I went on YouTube last night and I was looking at responses to the Evil God challenge, and that was the one that kept popping up, right? But then I noticed, and I'm not familiar with this person at all. It popped up an episode that it was on the Joe Rogan podcast. It was this guy called Jack Saints, who's actually written an entire book called Defeating the God Challenge, and I think that was what he was promoting on that podcast at the time. But have you read this book, and what's your reaction been to that book if you have read it?
Oh yeah, I haven't. To be perfectly honest, I haven't read the book, but the book is based on his doctoral thesis, for which I was an examiner.
Oh right.
Yeah. So I have got a pretty good idea of what's in the book. And I've talked to him about it. It's very involved. You have to read it quite carefully. It's quite complicated. And I've explained to him why I think his responses don't really work. And he's kind of backtracked on some things. I think that's fair to say. I think he would allow that. But it's, we can't really do justice to what he has to say here, because I can't even off the top of my head remember. It's quite complicated and involved responses. But yeah, Jack, no, I know him very well.
I wonder, has there been any other responses to this Evil God challenge that have, made you think of some new ideas or looked at something in a different way? What's the best response you've seen to the Evil God challenge, if you have seen a good one?
Probably your best bet is to go for skeptical theism, and say, okay, then, there is no good empirical evidence that there's no evil God. Good is not good evidence that there's no evil God, in just the same way that evil is not good evidence that there's no good God. I'm just going to bite the bullet and go with that. So now you're being consistent, at least across the two God hypotheses. But then you can insist that maybe there's some really good argument for the existence of a good God that can't be mirrored for the existence of an evil God, or something like that. And then you've got some leverage now. So you're not forcing both gods way down on the scale of reasonableness, because we're saying no, the observational evidence is not good evidence against these two gods. So both have risen up the scale somewhat, and now you can start boosting the good God by coming up with arguments for a good. That's probably, I think, Glenn Peoples. He's a guy based in New Zealand, I think. He came up with something along those lines. I think that's probably a best bet, something like that. Skeptical theism doesn't work, though, for reasons I've explored elsewhere, and so that's not going to get you out of trouble. And also, there aren't really any good arguments for a God, so none of this is going to work. But that would be the strategy that I would probably go for.
Amazing. Well, just before we wrap up, just a couple of questions. The first being, throughout all the debates you've had, or the people you've met along the way, I wonder what would be a good example of effective debate. Who from the other side of this argument have you had the most constructive conversation with, and you thought, you know what, that's how a debate should be held, and you came away from the experience, feeling good about it? Because sometimes debates can go the opposite way. But what's the most constructive example you've had of a proper debate?
Oh, okay. Well, the best debater in terms of just kind of winning it was undoubtedly William Lane Craig. He's a very good debater, but that wasn't necessarily the most constructive debate in terms of feeling like it had a really mutually beneficial conversation exploring the issues. I think maybe John Lennox, actually, who I get on well with John Lennox. I mean, he's not even a philosopher, so it's a bit of a pushover, really, in terms of, to be perfectly honest, once you get into the philosophy. But he's kind of, he'll listen to you and you can have a conversation with him. And, he takes you seriously, and he's not just not necessarily just trotting out the stock responses, reading off the script. Yeah, and so I quite enjoyed having conversations with John Lennox. I mean, in debates, but also, we've had chats privately as well, and I quite enjoyed talking. Yeah, I enjoy talking to John Lennox.
Amazing. I'm glad you said that, because we've had John Lennox on this show, and John Lennox, he was very, very complimentary about people like Christopher Hitchens, and he was very complimentary of the other side of the argument, and he is just a person, I think, that just appreciated the good side of the conversation, and did it in a really a professional way, and he seems like a fantastic guy as well.
Yeah, I think he is a fantastic guy. Yeah, I like him. Yeah,
amazing. Well, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah.
Well, the final question I have for you, I ask every guest that comes on the show, whether you are a philosopher or an actor or a sportsman, I ask the same question. And that is, for Stephen Law right now, what makes life worth living?
Well, I've got a great family, and also things I really enjoy probably the most are, I just got come back from the Stubai Alps, where I was going hut to hut across the glaciers and peaks with a bunch of old gits. I'm 64, we're aged 60 to 67, but we're still capable of doing that, and I'll continue to do that for as long as I can. And then I play drum kit, jazz, well, all sorts of stuff, rock. And so, yeah, I'm doing a gig on Sunday. So, yeah, I really enjoy that stuff. And of course, this has nothing whatsoever to do with sort of the academic side of things. So, yeah. But in terms of, I'll be dead soon, and what's my legacy? I suppose the fact that I've written some books that have, I clearly have had an effect on some people's lives. People have started, possibly a bad effect. People have started studying philosophy as a result of being exposed to my books fairly early on, and so on. So it's nice to see. It's nice to see that you've made some sort of difference. Hopefully, a good one. Yeah, so that's been good. Yeah,
definitely. Well, for all our audience listening and watching right now, some, they may have clicked on this video because they're already familiar with your work, but we do have, a big portion of our audience come along for the ride every episode. So for those people who may not be familiar, where's the best place right now if they want to hear more from you, they want to check out more of your work, or maybe follow you on social media? Where's the best place we can send everyone right now?
Oh, well, I've got a blog that's got loads of stuff on different stuff, some philosophy, some sort of political ranting, and all sorts of stuff. At Stephen Law, Stephen with a PH, STEPHEN, LAW.org. If you Google that, it'll take you through to my blog. But I'm also on Twitter and Blue Sky and Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure that's linked in the description below. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. The hour's flown by for me, at least. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope we get to do this again someday in the future.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to. It was great. You've been a particularly good interviewer. I thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it.